My wife was in disbelief when she saw me standing next to the table where she was dining with another man. There was no shouting, no scandal. Just a heavy, piercing silence, as if the entire restaurant had stopped breathing. Her eyes fluttered, the glass in her hand slipped, and she whispered something barely audible, "This is not what you think," as she desperately tried to justify the unjustifiable. The man beside her didn't move a muscle, he seemed small and ridiculous before the silent storm raging over that table. I didn't need to say anything. I just looked. I looked like someone seeing a stranger after years of sharing their life, their bed, their dreams. And in that look, she understood. She understood that I knew everything. That the nights filled with attention she'd given me weeks before weren't out of love, they were out of guilt. That the sweet words that began to reappear, the dinners, the caresses, were merely thinly veiled attempts to make up for the cowardly decision she'd already made, betraying the love of her life for a moment of selfishness. I didn't scream. I didn't kick the man out. I just left. And that night, I didn't sleep. I just sat on the couch and watched the ceiling until the sun rose. My thoughts raced. How could someone deceive you with such zeal, with such calculation? How could someone make love to you one night and plan a date with someone else the next day? The memories of each moment passed through me like blades. The Sundays in the park. Breakfast in bed on our anniversary. The promises made under a light rain in our first apartment. All of that now carried a new weight. She had chosen to erase all of that for something that didn't even seem to have any real value. And that was when I decided, I didn't deserve to beg for love. I wasn't going to fight for something that only made sense to me. Divorce was inevitable. But it wasn't the divorce that destroyed me. It was what I discovered later. And, most importantly, what she did next. For weeks, she tried to maintain the lie. She texted saying she was sorry. She said that dinner had just been a misunderstanding. I was trying to paint this man as a coworker, as a longtime friend. But every sentence was an insult to my intelligence. And when I realized there was nothing left to salvage, I decided to dig deeper. I investigated. I called numbers she was trying to hide. I scoured receipts, locations, until I found her. And what I discovered wasn't just confirmation of the betrayal, it was how willing she was to lie to save her image, even at the cost of my dignity. She didn't just cheat on me. She made a fool of me. But see, time is both cruel and fair. Betrayal, even when buried, rots the roots of any good memory. And when love rots, the only thing left is silence. The kind of silence that arrives when forgiveness sets in, not to bring peace to the one who wronged, but to free the one who was hurt. It was in that silence that she understood I was leaving forever. When I let go of my anger, when I stopped responding, when I stopped caring. It was no longer revenge, no longer pain. It was just indifference. And that was what destroyed her the most. A few months later, she tried to come back. She came to me with tears in her eyes, telling me it had been a mistake, that the other man had never meant anything, that only now had she realized how much she loved me. But I wasn't the same anymore. The man who loved her with all his soul had died that night in the restaurant. What was left was a new man. A man who had learned to love himself. She insisted. She showed up at the door of my new home. She brought flowers, as if that were enough. She brought memories, as if they still mattered to me. She brought apologies, as if any of them could mend what she herself had torn with her own hands. And, above all, she had the desperate eyes of someone who already understood she had lost something she would never get back. That day, she asked me to talk. And I let her. Not out of hope, but out of respect for what we once were. We sat across from each other. She began to speak. And I listened in silence. Her words were filled with regret, pain, guilt. But none of them touched me as much as before. She told me she saw everything clearly now. That night had been the biggest mistake of her life. That she couldn't explain why she did what she did, but that she would do anything to make it right. I looked at her and said, "You lost me not the moment you betrayed me, but the moment you chose someone else over us both." She started to cry. She tried to hold my hand. But I calmly pulled away. I stood up and led her to the door. Before she left, she asked me if I still loved her. And I answered, looking into her eyes, "I loved you with everything I was. But today I love myself. And that's why I can't go back." She walked away silently. And I closed the door, not with relief, but with peace. Because in that moment, I knew I was finally free. What she didn't know was that that very day, I was going to dinner with someone. A woman I met by chance in a bookstore. Someone who knew how to listen to me without rushing. Who saw my scars and didn't try to cover them, but rather to understand them. A woman who appeared when I was no longer looking for anyone else, and perhaps that's why she was so special. Because she didn't come to fill a void. She came to accompany me on the path I'd rebuilt myself. Today, my ex-wife lives with regrets and memories. She discovered that the man she was having dinner with that night also had other lovers. She was discarded weeks later, like someone who's lost her charm. And now, all she has is the echo of a love she destroyed with her own hands. But the story doesn't end here. Because weeks after that dinner with my new partner, something happened that even I didn't expect. Something that made me look at the past with new eyes. Something that involved a place, a gesture, and a forgotten memory. Something that made me understand the true value of loyalty. And it was precisely in that moment that I realized, the greatest response to betrayal isn't anger or revenge. It's rebuilding. And it is in this reconstruction that lies the part of the story that I have never told anyone. Until now. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. On the contrary, we show through fictional and intensely emotional stories how infidelity destroys lives, families, and true feelings. Each narrative brings a profound lesson about choices, consequences, and irreparable losses. Get ready to listen now. A shocking story, realistic and unforgettable. Buckle up, the truth will hurt. Lucas was always a simple man at heart, but complex in his emotions. He worked as a civil engineer, respected in the field for his discretion, his ethics, and his constant pursuit of doing everything as correctly as possible. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His presence, his firm gaze, the tranquility he conveyed in restrained and precise gestures were enough. He wasn't one for grand speeches, but rather for actions that made a statement. He never used to exaggerate, either in his dress or his words, but he was careful, detail-oriented, and extremely sensitive when it came to those he loved. Especially her. Isabella. His childhood sweetheart, his lifelong partner in building a new life. Isabella was Lucas's complete opposite. Extroverted, energetic, with a wide laugh that filled any room. She had something in her eyes that blended sweetness with a hint of impatience, like someone never content with what they already had and always searching for something more, even without knowing exactly what that was. She worked as a marketing consultant and had a natural talent for engaging people. She was persuasive, communicative, and at the same time, possessed a refined sensitivity that allowed her to perceive emotional nuances where others only saw the surface. When she met Lucas, she felt something she had never experienced before: peace. For the first time, someone wasn't trying to keep up with her pace, but offered shelter. And that, for many years, was exactly what she needed. They met while still in college, at a lecture on sustainable construction. Lucas was speaking on stage, and Isabella, who wasn't even in the field, happened to be there, accompanying a friend. But that night, amidst equations and technical graphs, what stuck with her was the way he looked at her as he stepped off the stage. It wasn't an invasive look, nor a flirtatious one, it was a curious, silent, and incredibly respectful one. It touched her. And that same day, amidst books, hallways, and coffee, they began talking. It wasn't an explosive romance, the kind that takes your breath away upon first meeting. It was calm, built over time, with deep conversations and a connection that seemed to grow slowly. Within a few months, it was as if they'd always belonged together. Over time, the achievements came. Their first apartment, small but full of meaning. The simple ceremony in the countryside, with close friends and promises whispered through suppressed tears. The plans for children that were postponed, first by careers, then by insecurities, then by mutual decision. They eventually discovered they were enough for each other. And that was enough. They spent over a decade traveling together, facing job changes, coping with family losses, starting over when necessary. They were never a perfect couple, but they were, indeed, accomplices. In all their frailties. Their routine was marked by small but profound gestures. He made her coffee every day before he left. She left short notes in his lunchbox on Fridays, wishing him, "Have a good weekend, my love." On Sundays, they would walk to a local market, where she would buy flowers and he would buy artisanal bread. On the way back, they would have breakfast on the porch, laughing at old acquaintances and discussing neighborhood news. Isabella loved to talk about the office's clients, her campaigns, and the dramas between colleagues. Lucas listened to everything, even when he already knew the characters by heart. And when she fell silent, he looked at her as if he were still listening. This was the kind of love they shared, quiet, constant, built on understanding silences. But, like every true story, there were also shadows. Isabella, for the past 2 years, seemed restless. The same restlessness that made her vibrant also made her yearn for change. Sometimes I complained that life was too stagnant. Other times, he said he missed something, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Lucas, on the other hand, felt increasingly satisfied with the little things. After a bout of burnout at work, he had learned to value calm, simple rituals, and the quiet of home. He reconnected with old hobbies, began reading more, and started playing the guitar again on weekends. He tried to engage Isabella, but she rarely showed any interest. She preferred to be connected to the world, to social media, to the avalanche of stimuli that seemed to fill her time but not her soul. He noticed the changes. He noticed when she started going out more, when her smiles began to seem more forced. He noticed the long silences at the table, the short answers on the couch. He felt it, but couldn't name it. And as he always did, he chose to trust. He believed it was just a phase. That soon she would find herself again, and everything would fall into place again. Isabella, on the other hand, began to drift away without realizing it. Her routine filled with appointments, meetings, dinners with colleagues. When Lucas called her for something, she already had another commitment. When he asked how she was, she would reply with "tired" and go straight to her room. The touch between them, once natural, now seemed rehearsed. Kisses became formal. Eyes became rare. Even so, Lucas remained there. Making coffee, tending to the plants, waiting for her on the couch with a blanket on his lap. Sometimes he tried to rekindle some connection, a short trip, a surprise dinner, a letter left in her bag. Isabella smiled, thanked him, but the flame didn't rekindle. There was something absent, invisible, a space between them that seemed to grow with each passing day. Still, they slept side by side. They shared the same bed, but they no longer dreamed together. And he knew it. Deep down, he knew. But how could he accept that the love he'd always believed he was building solidly was now slipping through his fingers? Close friends noticed the distance but avoided commenting. Isabella always had a knack for deflecting questions with charm and wit. Lucas, for his part, never left room for speculation. He protected what he felt. He protected their story. He believed that love required discretion, and that everything would resolve itself in time. Perhaps that's why he was so blind to the small changes. Or perhaps he did see it, but refused to accept it. On a typical Saturday, they decided to renovate their room. As they moved furniture, rearranged drawers, and chose new colors for the walls, for a moment they looked the same as they had years ago. They laughed together when they found an old travel album, reminiscing about the cold of that night in Buenos Aires, the hurried coffees in Lisbon, the long baths in a cottage lost in the southern mountains. Isabella held a photo for several seconds. There was a sparkle in her eyes. Lucas watched her silently. This nostalgia touched him deeply. He felt there was still hope. That night, he prepared dinner. He placed candles on the table and prepared a special wine, the one he saved for a future occasion that never arrived. Isabella was late, as usual, but she arrived. She looked beautiful, wearing a blue dress he loved. During dinner, she smiled. He touched her hand, and for a moment, everything seemed the same. As if time had turned back. He took advantage of this rare moment of connection to tell her how important she was, how much he still believed in them. She listened. Silently. With moist eyes. She didn't respond. Days later, she began acting more affectionate. She started texting during the day, snuggling closer on the couch, laughing more lightly. Lucas felt his heart warm again. He thought maybe that dinner had been the turning point. That maybe, finally, she had reconnected with the feelings that had united them. Little by little, he started making plans again. A weekend in the countryside. A dinner with old friends. A renewal of vows on their next wedding anniversary. Isabella agreed to everything, but vaguely, as if responding so as not to hurt feelings. Still, Lucas clung to the idea that everything was falling into place. What he didn't know, and couldn't even imagine, is that behind those comforting gestures, there was something hidden. That behind the sudden smile, there was something unsustainable over time. And that each return of affection was, in fact, a silent attempt to cover up an abyss that had already been dug. But the truth, as always, would come. And it would come like a violent wave, the kind that rips the roots of what seemed solid. What Lucas didn't yet know was that the moment when everything would change forever already had a date, time, and place. And when that moment arrived, he would not only discover what was hidden, but also reveal within himself a strength he hadn't even known existed. A strength that would rebuild him from the ashes. And that would make Isabella, for the first time, see what she had lost. She didn't know it yet, but soon, she would understand the weight of a bad choice. And it would all start, with dinner. Lucas began to observe Isabella more closely, but not out of distrust, at least, not yet. It was a kind of silent attention, born of an almost imperceptible unease, like a draft of cold air entering through a crack in a window. She smiled more often, but this smile didn't have the same roots as before. It was like a cut flower, beautiful on the outside, but already beginning to die on the inside. He noticed she was lighter, yes, but it didn't seem light because she was at peace, but because she carried less than she should. Her eyes avoided his in the most intimate moments, as if averted for fear of revealing something not yet ready to be confronted. Still, Lucas clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, she was simply reconnecting with herself. Maybe this was all just a new cycle, a phase of rediscovery. That's what he told himself, over and over, silently. That week, Isabella started leaving work later. She said they were working on an important campaign, which required after-hours meetings and urgent adjustments to projects with tight deadlines. Lucas understood. He'd been in such situations himself. But something in her voice seemed overly rehearsed. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it. The calculated pauses, the way she glanced at her phone before answering a simple question. The messages that arrived during dinner, the calls she answered in another room. Small details that Lucas recorded, one by one, like someone putting together pieces of a puzzle, unsure of the final image. One night, when he entered the room, he found Isabella sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at her phone with a small smile. When he entered, she quickly locked the screen and got up, saying she was going to take a shower. The gesture was so automatic that for a second he thought he'd imagined it all. But there, in that moment, an inner click made him realize something was wrong. It wasn't anger. It was a coldness, an absence, a feeling as if the ground was beginning to give way beneath his feet. He said nothing. He just stood there, staring at her pillow as if engraved on it were answers that would never be spoken. The next day, Isabella didn't come home at her usual time. She said she was going to dinner with the office team after an important presentation. Lucas, trying not to feed any ghosts, wished her luck and made himself dinner. He ate alone, in silence, with the sound of the rain beating against the window. With each bite, he felt her absence grow like a shadow. At 10:30, she texted him saying she was on her way. When she arrived, the scent of her perfume seemed more intense than usual. And there was something about her hair, something new. She said she'd spent some time in the car talking to a colleague, that the rain was too heavy to drive in a hurry. Lucas, without saying anything, just nodded. It wasn't the right time. But something inside him had already changed. 2 days later, while organizing some documents in his home office, Lucas noticed that Isabella's usual tablet was unlocked on the desk. He hesitated. He'd never been the type to snoop, to be suspicious, to spy. But that day, his hesitation lasted less than his doubt. Opening the browser, he found an active restaurant reservation tab. A date set, a different place from the ones they usually frequented together. His name wasn't on the reservation. There was no celebration planned, no known event. Just a dinner for two at a restaurant Isabella never mentioned. Lucas felt his stomach churn. There were no messages, no names, no explicit evidence. But his intuition screamed like never before. He decided not to confront her. Not yet. Instead, on the day of the dinner, he pretended he had a meeting with a client in another city. He left home early, with an empty suitcase and a heavy heart. He parked the car near the restaurant and waited. Time passed slowly. Each minute seemed denser than the last. And then she arrived. Alone. A black dress, high heels, flawless makeup. She was beautiful. Beautiful in the way she only looked on nights when he planned something special. But he wasn't the one she was meeting. Minutes later, another car pulled up. A man got out, wearing a blazer and carrying himself with a posture far too confident for someone unfamiliar with her. He walked straight to where she was waiting. When they met, the embrace was intimate. The kiss on the cheek lasted a few seconds too long. They walked in together. Laughing. Talking. Touching each other naturally. Lucas didn't need to see anything else. That was enough. That hurt more than any concrete proof. Because what I saw there wasn't just a physical betrayal. It was the breaking of everything I believed was unbreakable. He waited outside, his hands sweaty, his chest burning. He considered leaving. He considered never speaking to her again. But something inside him demanded more. Demanded presence. Demanded eye contact. So he stood, straightened his collar, and entered. The room was bustling, but his eyes went straight to the table in the corner, where Isabella and the man were laughing as they toasted. When she saw him, the color drained from her face. Her glass trembled. Her smile faded. Her eyes widened as if she'd seen a ghost. The other man stared at Lucas blankly, until Isabella's expression gave it all away. Embarrassment filled the room. The waiter next to her froze, tray in hand. Lucas walked to the table with slow but steady steps. His gaze held not hatred, but disappointment. A heavy, silent sadness, impossible to disguise. When he stopped in front of them, Isabella tried to speak, but her words tumbled out. She said it was a business dinner, that nothing was wrong, that he was being hasty. She tried to smile, tried to stand up, tried to make the moment seem ordinary. But it was too late. Lucas stared at her for a long time. Then he turned and left. Without a fuss. Without a word. Just silence. The silence of someone who has just witnessed the end of a story without needing to hear its final chapter. That night, he drove for hours. The radio was off, the city lights passing like shadows. He thought about everything they'd built, everything he'd given, everything he'd believed in. He thought about their first kiss, their first night in the small apartment, the blue dress at the ceremony, the Sundays at the market. All of that now seemed distant, like a memory from another life. And yet, he still loved her. Love doesn't disappear with a glimpse. It endures. It hurts. It bleeds. But it still pulses. When he got home, he found the place intact. The photos still on the walls. The cups on the drying rack. Her coat on the armchair. He sat on the sofa and took a deep breath. He didn't cry. He didn't break anything. He just breathed. For the first time in years, he felt the need to think about himself. Not to escape. But to survive. He picked up his phone and started writing a message. He stopped halfway through. He deleted it. He would let her take the initiative. If there was something to say, let her say it. The next morning, Isabella didn't return. He didn't text her either. He didn't try to explain, didn't try to apologize. Which made everything even clearer. Lucas didn't look for her. He simply let time guide his next steps. But inside him, something was shifting. The pain was giving way to a kind of bitter understanding. He knew there was still something unsaid. Something Isabella was hiding behind that encounter. Something that was yet to come. And deep down, he knew that what he discovered that night was just the beginning. Lucas didn't look for Isabella in the days that followed. She didn't show any signs either. It was as if they had both signed a silent pact of distance, an implicit agreement that the truth no longer needed to be spoken aloud. What they saw that night was enough to rewrite everything. But the silence that at first seemed liberating soon became a dull weight, taking over every room in the house. Her clothes were still there, but they no longer smelled. Things remained in their places, but they were dead. He didn't touch anything. It was as if he wanted everything to bear witness to what had happened, as if the objects held the echo of lies and needed to be confronted before being removed. The following Friday, Lucas received a short, emotionless message, "Can we talk tonight?" It took him hours to respond. Not out of pride, but because he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. In the end, he simply wrote, "Okay." When she arrived, it was already night. She wore simple clothes, her face clean, without makeup, her eyes marked by deep dark circles. She seemed smaller. She sat on the sofa without asking permission, as if she still believed she had some right to that space. Lucas stood for a few moments, watching her. Finally, he sat in the armchair, with a dry, restrained gesture. She began speaking bluntly, saying that what happened was a mistake, that she didn't know how to deal with her own frustrations, that there was no real excuse, but she regretted it. She said this without crying, with an almost technical tone, as if she were delivering a report. He listened silently, without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned forward slightly and said he wanted to understand why. That was all. Why? Isabella lowered her eyes and replied, after long seconds, that she had lost herself, that she thought the love between them had died, that she sought outside for what she no longer felt at home. Lucas simply nodded, without judgment. But the pain was there, hidden behind her calm gaze. Then he said he didn't want any more lies. He asked her to tell him everything. Not the physical details, but the truth behind the betrayal. He wanted to know since when, how much truth there was in those recent smiles, if the dinners, the caresses, had been sincere or just guilty distractions. Isabella hesitated, but confessed that she had met the man a few months earlier, that it all started with innocent conversations, casual encounters, and that before she realized it, she was already in too deep. She said she tried to end it several times, that she felt guilty, but that at the same time, there was something about that relationship that made her feel alive again. She said this with a choked voice, but still without tears. Lucas just listened, his fingers intertwined, his jaw tense. When she finished, she apologized again. She said she knew she had destroyed everything, but that she wanted a chance to rebuild, to redeem herself, to prove that there was still love between them. It was at that moment that he stood, walked to the bookshelf, and picked up a small wooden box. He handed it to her silently. Isabella opened the box and found dozens of old cards, birthday notes, letters he'd written but never sent. Among them was a sealed envelope, dated 2 months earlier. She opened it and began to read. It was a letter from Lucas, written the night he'd planned to take her out for a special dinner. A letter in which he described in detail how he'd prepared a surprise to celebrate their wedding anniversary, how he'd booked a weekend at a bed and breakfast, how he intended to renew their wedding vows in an intimate way. He said that, even though he felt a certain distance from her, he still believed they could be the same again, and that he was willing to try anything. By the time she finished reading, Isabella was crying. Not just from sadness, but from the deep pain of someone who understands too late what they've lost. Lucas sat back down and said, his voice firm, that he had forgiven her. That he held no hatred, that he wished her no harm. But that the love he felt for her had died that night in the restaurant. He said she had destroyed not only their marriage, but his image of her. And that, no matter how much forgiveness there was no going back. Isabella begged, said she was willing to start over, that she would rebuild everything brick by brick, but he wouldn't give in. He simply said she deserved something different now. That after so much sacrifice, she at least deserved to choose herself. And it was at that point that she completely broke down. Still, she kept trying. She called, texted, showed up unannounced. Lucas treated her with respect, but always with the same distance. There was no anger, but there was an end. An irretrievable end. It was then, months later, already officially separated, that Isabella discovered something by chance. She was passing near a park where they used to walk on Sundays and decided to go in. She sat down on a bench, on impulse, and stayed there for a few minutes. That's when she saw Lucas. He was on the other side of the square, accompanied by a woman. They were holding hands, laughing. Beside them, a girl of about 8 was running across the lawn. Isabella froze. She watched for minutes that felt like hours. The way he smiled, the way he touched the woman's face, the way he spoke to the girl. There was a lightness there she hadn't seen in him in a long time. When she finally stood up and walked toward them, her heart was pounding. Lucas saw her from afar. His expression was one of restrained surprise, but without tension. The woman beside him looked at him and understood. The child ran back and clung to Lucas's legs. He bent down and whispered something in her ear. The girl turned to Isabella with a shy smile. Isabella stopped a few steps away. The silence between them was almost unbearable. Until she said she didn't know he was with anyone. Lucas nodded, without explaining himself. He simply said he met the woman at a book group and that they had been together for a few months. Isabella asked who the girl was. He replied matter-of-factly, her daughter. But now, also my daughter. She didn't know what to say. Lucas then looked at her tenderly and said something that cut through her like a blade. He said he'd always believed love was a daily choice. That he'd spent years choosing between two people. But now, finally, he felt he was being chosen back. Isabella tried to argue, to say she still loved him, that she still felt he was the love of her life. But he calmly replied, I thought you were the love of my life, too. But now I realize that the love of my life is me. Because only when I learned to love myself did I stop begging to be loved. Isabella's tears flowed uncontrollably. The woman beside Lucas watched her respectfully. The girl tugged at his hand, asking to play. Lucas waved goodbye discreetly and walked with them to an open field, where they began to run together. Isabella stood still, alone. And in that moment, everything fell upon her with the weight of a lifetime. She understood that she had lost more than a marriage. She had lost her admiration. She had lost her gaze. She had lost her place. Not because of an isolated mistake, but because of a continuous choice not to care for what truly mattered. And what she didn't know, what she would only understand when she opened the last box he left in her old house, was that in that photo hanging in a cafe where they used to drink coffee, he had left a dedication written weeks before their divorce. Beneath the image of the two of them, smiling over 2 cups, he wrote, "Here began the best love of my life. And also the place where I learned to never forget myself." It destroyed her. Because there, for the first time, she understood clearly that there was no going back. That the love she once received would never be hers again. Because he not only forgave, he also moved on. And that was something she would never be able to achieve again. Isabella spent days in silence after that reunion in the park. The image of Lucas walking hand in hand with another woman and being called father by a girl she'd never seen before haunted her with the intensity of a vivid nightmare. It was as if it had all happened in a parallel universe where she no longer belonged. It wasn't seeing him with someone else that devastated her, it was the naturalness with which he seemed happy, fulfilled, whole. As if she had never existed. As if the years they'd lived together, the plans, the touches, and the promises had been just an irrelevant chapter in his story. She couldn't understand how everything could change so quickly, how he'd managed to rebuild himself so beautifully while she was still drowning in regret and emptiness. In the days that followed, she tried to move on with her life as best she could. She returned to work, immersed herself in campaigns, feigned interest in meetings that seemed like background noise. Colleagues would ask if everything was okay, and she would smile, even with sunken eyes and a trembling voice. At night, she would sit on the sofa in the living room of her old apartment, now hers alone, and stare for hours into the void. She was haunted by the silence they once shared so intimately. Lucas's absence was a ghost present in every corner. Every sound that was gone, every routine that was once shared, now served only to remind her of everything she had lost. She began collecting memories as a form of punishment, revisiting old conversations, reading letters he had written, rewatching videos of him laughing, holding the camera, and capturing moments that now seemed so distant and unattainable. One afternoon, he decided to go to the old restaurant where they used to celebrate birthdays. He asked for the same table as always, made the same order. The waiter recognized her and asked for Lucas. She simply smiled and said he wouldn't be coming. He ate in silence, watching the couples around him. In every laugh, every toast, I saw pieces of the life I had and would no longer have. As he left, he passed by the sidewalk where they had once danced together to a street performer. That day, Lucas had pulled her into an impromptu dance, and she had laughed out loud, oblivious to who saw her. Now, as she passed by, she could barely stand. Overcome by a suffocating unease, she decided to seek him out. She sent a simple message, asking for just 5 minutes to talk. Lucas didn't respond immediately. It took 2 days. And when he did, he accepted. They arranged a discreet coffee date downtown, where the chances of meeting acquaintances would be slim. Isabella arrived first, anxious, her heart pounding. She wore an outfit he always complimented, tied her hair in a way she knew he found beautiful. But when she saw him arrive, she realized none of that would make a difference. He entered with calm steps, a warm smile, and a serene gaze. There was no anger, no coldness. There was only distance. That emotional distance that can't be seen, but can be felt. They sat across from each other. The initial silence was broken by Isabella, who apologized again, her voice cracking, and said she hadn't found peace since seeing him in the park. Lucas thanked her but didn't say much. She asked if he was happy. He said yes. That he had found someone who looked at him the way he'd always dreamed of being looked at. That his partner's daughter taught him daily about pure love, and that, for the first time, he felt he was building a life free of doubts, lies, or imbalances. Isabella swallowed hard. She tried to justify herself, saying that her mistake wasn't due to a lack of love, but to confusion, an internal imbalance. But Lucas just nodded understandingly, like someone who's heard it many times and isn't affected anymore. Then Isabella asked the question she'd been rehearsing for days, if there was any chance, even a small one, of starting over. She said she was willing to wait, to change, to do anything to prove she still loved him. Lucas took a deep breath, looked at her with a heaviness in his eyes that stemmed from much more than that conversation, and responded with something she hadn't expected. He said he hadn't simply gotten over the betrayal. He'd understood that what bound him to her wasn't love anymore, but habit, memory, history. He said forgiveness came when he realized that love must be chosen every day, and that she'd chosen something else while he was still fighting for both of them. And then, in a lower tone, he revealed something he'd kept to himself until then. He said that a month before the betrayal was discovered, he had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition. It wasn't serious, but it required lifestyle changes, constant monitoring, and emotional support. At the time, he decided not to tell Isabella right away, as he was still processing everything. He was preparing to talk to her the following weekend, after the dinner he had prepared, the same dinner she had missed, claiming she was having a work event. While he was planning to reveal his vulnerability, she was meeting with her lover. And it was there, in that brutal contrast between fragility and abandonment, that he realized he was alone. Isabella brought her hand to her mouth in shock. Her eyes filled with tears. She asked why he never said anything. He replied that he tried. But that when he needed her most, she wasn't there. Not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to be. He said this was more painful than the betrayal itself. Because it wasn't just about the body, it was about the absence. The lack of listening. The denial of presence. Isabella wept uncontrollably. She begged for forgiveness between sobs. He said she would have stayed if she had known, that she would have cared for him with everything she had. But he just smiled and replied, "I know. But what hurt most was precisely this, knowing that you would only have chosen to stay if you knew I was sick. And I wanted you to choose me even when I was whole." She tried to touch his hand, but he gently pulled away. He said the conversation needed to end there. That now he understood everything clearly. That life, however painful, offers new opportunities to those who don't bury themselves in sorrow. He said he had freed himself. That he held no anger or resentment. But that there was no longer any room for her. Isabella asked for a hug before leaving. He stood, hesitated for a moment, but complied. They hugged for a few seconds. She buried her face in his chest as if trying to stop time. But he simply rested his chin on her hair and whispered, "Go in peace. And take care." Leaving that cafe, Isabella felt a void greater than any other. Not because she'd been rejected. But because she understood that the forgiveness she'd received was, in fact, confirmation of the end. And there was no greater pain than this, being forgiven by someone who had finally learned to live well, without you. 2 months later, Lucas and his new partner celebrated her daughter's birthday with a picnic in the park. Close friends, laughter, and light music. Isabella, from afar, happened to watch. She didn't approach. She just observed. And in that moment, she understood that his happiness wasn't a provocation. It was a consequence. The consequence of someone who chose to be whole, even after being broken. And it was there that she knew, without a doubt, that she had lost the love of her life through a choice that, at the time, seemed harmless, but which destroyed everything that was true. And the pain she felt in that moment, was her true punishment. Because no punishment is crueler than seeing, with one's own eyes, what could have been, and never will be. The cafe where their last conversation took place became a symbolic breaking point in both their memories. For Lucas, it was the place where he could finally free himself from everything that imprisoned him in that version of himself shaped by expectations, vain hopes, and broken promises. For Isabella, that small space with its pale walls and the smell of freshly roasted coffee became the epicenter of her deepest regret. It was as if, in that place, she had witnessed her own emotional funeral. From that moment on, everything that once seemed reversible became definitive, irreparable, and irreversible. She no longer knew how to walk lightly, for each step was marked by memories of a time when she was still chosen, loved, and cared for. And now, Lucas's silence was no longer a pause between attempts, it was a firm and clear final point, the kind of silence that screams and echoes, reminding her every day that she is no longer the woman of his life. She began to live with the small punishments of everyday life, those that leave no visible marks but corrode her from within. The cell phone that no longer beeped with affectionate messages, the empty bed where the sheets no longer held human warmth, the declined invitations from mutual friends who, without explicitly saying so, had chosen sides. Isabella began to realize that the betrayal had not only destroyed her marriage, but also her support network, her credibility, and even her very sense of identity. Because, little by little, people stopped asking about Lucas, stopped mentioning his name in conversations. It was as if he had disappeared from her life so profoundly that even others understood that remembering him would be a difficult burden to bear. Meanwhile, Lucas was going through the opposite process. Silently, he rebuilt himself patiently and unhurriedly. He learned to recognize his own limits and, more than that, to respect them. He found pleasure in the simple things, the morning walk, the coffee shared with his new partner on a bright balcony, the improvised drawings that the little girl who was now part of his life proudly gave him, calling him father naturally. He didn't pretend nothing had happened, he didn't deny his past. He had simply decided that that past would no longer be the place where he would dwell. It was as if he had placed all his pain in a small boat and let time carry it away, unhurriedly, until it dissolved into the horizon. But none of that meant he didn't feel it. There were still days when memories crept back in, seemingly trivial details. The smell of shampoo in a hallway, a specific song playing in the back of a store, a restaurant he'd turn his head past just to make sure it wasn't there. At those times, Lucas simply took a deep breath and accepted it. He didn't fight the memory, nor did he surrender to it. He knew it would be arrogance to believe he could erase such a profound history with a single decision. He'd learned to live with longing like someone who accepts a scar, it's there, visible, but it no longer hurts as it once did. Isabella, on the other hand, began to be consumed by an almost obsessive need to make amends. Not by the hope of winning Lucas back, although, deep down, that desire had never died, but by a yearning to redeem herself in her own eyes. She began therapy, revisited old issues, and talked to her mother about feelings she had held in for years. She sought to understand why she had destroyed what was most precious to her, why she had betrayed someone who had always been there. And the deeper she delved into herself, the more she came face to face with the version of herself she had always avoided, the woman who sabotages herself, who confuses freedom with escape, who confuses attention with passion. She began writing letters she never sent, letters to Lucas, to herself, to the woman she had been, and to the woman she dreamed of being. Life went on. Lucas no longer spoke of her to anyone. At home, his new partner understood this silence and respected it. She never forced comparisons, never demanded a place. She simply occupied, naturally, the space he gave her. She was a light, generous presence, yet firm enough to help him not back down in moments of vulnerability. When he told her about his past, she didn't ask for details. She simply held his hand and told him he didn't need to prove anything to deserve peace. And in that moment, Lucas understood that mature love doesn't shout, doesn't beg, doesn't demand. It simply is. One night, Isabella ran into a mutual friend she hadn't seen in a long time. They chatted briefly, and he mentioned how well Lucas was doing, how renewed he seemed, more centered, lighter. She smiled softly, but her heart sank. It wasn't envy. It was the bittersweet pain of someone who understands that another's happiness is concrete proof of how much they've freed themselves. She asked if he still talked about her. His friend hesitated and gently said no. That he rarely mentioned the past. Isabella thanked him, and as she turned the corner, she felt a lump in her throat. Because forgetting, when it comes without hurt, is even more devastating. It's proof that the other has healed. And that you're left behind. Later, she received an unexpected invitation. A mutual acquaintance invited her to an art exhibition. He said Lucas would be there, that it might be a good chance to rekindle a cordial, mature relationship. Isabella hesitated, but accepted. Perhaps she needed to see for herself that the world hadn't stopped. She arrived early, dressed soberly, trying to control her anxiety. When she saw him from afar, she noticed he was laughing at something a woman nearby was saying. He was relaxed, with the demeanor of someone who knew where and who he was. She didn't approach immediately. She watched. The friend saw her and called her over. Lucas looked over, smiled politely, and waved. A respectful but distant wave. They talked for a few minutes. She asked how his health was, and he replied that he was fine, that his tests were stable, and that the new routine was good for his heart. She talked about her work, and he listened with interest. But there was no intimacy anymore. Only respect. There was no subtext. Only words. And when he said goodbye, saying he had to go, Isabella understood that this was the goodbye they never had. A clean goodbye, without resentment, without hurt, without promise of return. He left, and she remained there, sitting, watching the crowd pass by, with the feeling that, finally, their story had reached its conclusion. And at that point in the journey, something inside her began to change. For the first time in a long time, she didn't cry when she saw him leave. She didn't torture herself with what could have been. She simply accepted it. And it was there, in that silence that no longer hurt, that she realized she was ready to start over. Not like before, trying to prove herself to someone. But now, trying to be a version of herself she could respect. There were still wounds, yes, but now there was also a desire to heal. And this desire was her new way of moving forward. Because some pains, no matter how intense, are not meant to be forgotten, they are meant to be understood. And that was how, between absences and forgiveness, their story finally began to find its way to the end that was to come. As the months passed, the memories ceased to be constant pain and became silent scars. Isabella, who before could barely look at her own reflection without feeling the weight of her wrong choices, now observed the mirror with a different attitude, more restrained, more aware. There was no complete redemption, no return, but there was, finally, the understanding that life went on, even when one wasn't ready to go with it. And this acceptance, though bitter, was also liberating. She no longer tried to force encounters, no longer sought messages, no longer created excuses to cross Lucas's path. His life had moved in a direction that allowed no further deviation. And now she began to chart a new path, still uncertain, still vulnerable, but her own. On an ordinary day, without expectations, a coworker invited her to participate in a social impact project in another city, something temporary, but which would require a few weeks of travel. She was reluctant, considered refusing, but ultimately accepted as a way to breathe outside of everything. The change of scenery did her good. The new landscape, the unfamiliar people, the different schedules, all of this offered a silent respite from the memories that, from time to time, still wanted to take over her mind. There, Isabella rediscovered something she had lost long ago, a connection with herself. And this rediscovery didn't come with parties or celebrations, but with small moments where she felt pleasure in existing simply for who she was, without needing to justify, hide, or fight to be seen. One night, while walking by a lake surrounded by tall trees and a cold wind, she sat alone on a wooden bench and watched the darkening sky. She remembered the conversations she'd had with Lucas about growing old together, about children who never came, about travel plans that remained on unchecked lists. For once, she didn't cry. She simply took a deep breath and silently thanked the pain that now seemed to be on a different frequency. A man sat down next to her a few minutes later and struck up a conversation about the cold, the sky, how that city seemed frozen in time. He was kind, non-invasive, spoke simply, and listened attentively. Isabella truly smiled after a long time. Not out of immediate desire or sudden passion, but because she felt that perhaps there was life after the chaos. And in that small gesture, a natural smile, she understood that self-love was returning to its place. Meanwhile, Lucas was experiencing a new stage in his journey. The woman by his side was no longer just a comfortable presence, she had become an emotional anchor, someone who understood his silences, who laughed at his jokes, who knew when he needed space and when he needed a hug. Spending time with her daughter deepened his sense of belonging. He was no longer just a spectator in other people's lives, but a protagonist in his own. He began writing short texts, with no intention of publishing them. Just thoughts, reflections on what he had learned, on the fragility of human connections, on the value of emotional honesty. One rainy afternoon, he read a passage to his wife, and she cried, saying she had never felt so safe with someone. And in that moment, Lucas realized he was experiencing something that didn't require reconstruction, it was new, clean, free of comparisons. Life, however, always finds ways to test stability. At a casual event, a mutual friend of Isabella and Lucas organized a seminar on human relations and asked them to sit at different tables. It was a large event, with dozens of guests. Both hesitated, but accepted. They knew they would probably see each other again, but now with new contexts, new roles. The reunion was unlike any other. There was no tension, nor any anticipation. Just a brief greeting, a respectful smile. Isabella lectured on emotional self-sabotage and received a standing ovation. Lucas spoke about trust in times of uncertainty and moved the audience. They exchanged no more than brief, polite glances. And, curiously, in that absence of dialogue, there was more clarity than in any previous conversation. At the end of the event, during the cocktail hour, she approached him. She commented on his talk, praising the way he articulated his ideas with such honesty. He thanked her, saying it had been a long process before he could speak without fear. They talked for a few minutes about the event, their side projects, their lives. At one point, Isabella said something that sounded like a plea for release. "I know you don't hold a grudge, but sometimes I think it's harder to forgive me knowing you've forgiven me than if you still hated me." Lucas looked her in the eye and calmly replied, "Sometimes we need to accept that the consequence of what we did isn't the other person's punishment, but the irreversible change we caused in them." She nodded silently, swallowing the answer like someone accepting a diagnosis. And in that moment, they both knew it was the last time they would truly speak to each other. Returning to her new routine, Isabella wrote again. This time, not a letter to him, but to herself. A letter listing the moments she chose to remain silent when she should have spoken, run away when she should have confronted, hide when she should have revealed. And, at the end, she wrote something that remained with her: "I lost the love of my life. But perhaps it was this love that taught me to find myself." She sealed the letter, put it in a box, and left it in a closet. There was no longer any need to relive the pain. Now, it was time to move on. Lucas, in turn, entered a new phase. He began actively participating in social initiatives, volunteering in community groups, and writing more frequently. His partner encouraged, accompanied, and admired him. His relationship with her daughter grew so naturally that he no longer noticed the difference between biological and effective fatherhood. It was what he had always dreamed of having, a family built with care, presence, and truth. And one day, when he was called "Dad" in front of everyone, with the spontaneity typical of children, he felt something he had never felt before, the certainty that his story had not ended at the moment of grief, but had begun again there, in the daily construction of a new life. And even though they never crossed paths again, Isabella and Lucas continued to carry the story they lived not as a burden, but as a chapter that shaped who they became. Each, with their choices, their lessons, their pain, and their reconstruction, understood that some losses are, in fact, doors. And that sometimes, the greatest lesson of love is knowing when to let it go. Not for lack of feeling, but for excessive respect for what became impossible to restore. This awareness, silent and profound, would accompany them forever, not as a wound, but as a reminder that some truths come late and others save lives. Years after everything had shattered, time had done its part. Not erased, not healed completely, but transformed the pain into understanding. Lucas now walked through a Sunday garden, his beloved daughter playing in front of him and his partner sitting beside him on a wooden bench under the cool shade of a tree. The serenity of that moment came not from the absence of suffering, but from the awareness that he had had to go through emotional hell to deserve the peace he now experienced. The past was in its place, and there were no more empty spaces inside him waiting for something that had once been his. Everything he needed was there, within reach of a glance, a touch, the comfortable silence between two people who didn't need promises to continue. They were together because they chose each other every day and because they understood that love, to be true, doesn't need to scream, just endure. On the other side of this story, Isabella experienced a life marked by the absence, not only of Lucas, but of everything he represented. She had progressed, yes, and could smile, work, and talk. But behind each achievement was the echo of a choice that had changed everything. Her career flourished, she gained recognition, and she began to be invited to high-profile events and consulting gigs. However, professional success never managed to fill the emotional void she herself had created. At night, when she returned home, the silent apartment offered her memories in every piece of furniture, every shelf. She changed the furniture, changed the color of the walls, tried to give new meaning to the spaces, but it was within her that Lucas's presence still lingered. And it lingered not as desire, but as regret, like the kind of longing that doesn't demand return, but carries the weight of what can no longer be changed. One day, she received an unexpected letter from a mutual friend. It included an invitation to a group exhibition featuring artists and writers who had transformed their experiences into art. Among the names was Lucas. He had written a short story to be read publicly by an actor, titled "The Day I Chose to Follow." Isabella hesitated. She knew being there could be painful, but she also understood that not attending would be running away from something she, deep down, needed to hear. On the night of the performance, she arrived discreetly, sitting in the back, among strangers. The hall was full. As the text began to be read, the narrator's deep voice filled the space, and Lucas's words came as a dagger and a cure at the same time. He told of a man who, faced with his downfall, chose not to rebuild the rubble, but to build a new house on another plot of land. He spoke of absence, of betrayed loyalty, of pain without scandal. And, above all, of forgiveness that does not mean return, but freedom. Isabella held back tears as she listened, because each sentence revealed not only his pain but the transformation that followed. When the reading ended, the audience gave a standing ovation. She remained seated, motionless, her eyes fixed on the empty stage. She didn't look for Lucas at the end. She didn't try to approach him. She simply left in silence, walking down the cold street with a lump in her throat and her heart aching with the certainty that the man who had once belonged to her was now whole again, but whole in another place, with another woman, another life. And for the first time, she felt neither anger nor despair, only a profound respect for the story he had rewritten without her. Months later, Lucas published a book with the texts he had written during his rebirth process. He became a reference in emotional support groups, began giving lectures, and helped others who had experienced similar betrayals and losses. His new family was a constant source of joy and learning. Gradually, he realized that his story with Isabella, painful as it had been, was also what pushed him inward, forcing him to discover that true love begins when we learn to respect ourselves to the point of not accepting less than we deserve. In one of his lectures, when asked about regrets, he calmly responded that he did not regret what he had experienced, as it all prepared him for the life he now enjoyed with gratitude. Isabella then dedicated herself to young professionals, helping women find emotional independence, always with powerful discourses on choices, consequences, and self-knowledge. She never used her personal story as an example, but it was present in every unspoken line, in every piece of advice given with teary eyes and long pauses. One rainy afternoon, sitting in her living room, she wrote a final letter in her diary that was never sent. In it, she said, "I didn't lose you because you left me. I lost you when I chose not to see you. And now, all I can do is wish you continued living the beautiful life you built without me." She folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and sealed it with the phrase, "End of a cycle." They both moved on. She with the scar of absence, he with the peace of someone who found herself. They never saw each other again, nor wrote to each other. But if they happened to cross paths somewhere in the world, perhaps they would just look at each other for a second and know, silently, that it was all worth it. Because sometimes, losing someone isn't punishment, it's a lesson. And forgiving someone isn't getting back together, it's setting them free. True love isn't what binds, it's what teaches. And in this story, the lesson was clear: betrayal has the power to destroy even the most beautiful of feelings, because it breaks not just a bond, but the foundation that sustained it, trust. And now, we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Have you ever experienced something similar? Leave a comment below and share your opinion, experience, or reflection. Your participation is very important to us. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now to hear more impactful, moving stories filled with life lessons. Turn on the bell so you don't miss any of the next stories. And remember, cheating is never the way to go. It destroys not only relationships, but families, dreams, and the essence of love. Our channel does not support any kind of infidelity in any way. Here, we believe that respect and honesty are the foundation of everything. Until the next story.